Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 270. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about on today's show, but first I just want to remind people they can share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and I repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. I'm also the opinion editor at antiwar.com, and right now we're hosting a fundraiser. So if you would like to help myself, Scott Horton, Dave DeCamp, and the rest of the antiwar.com team keep doing what we're doing, putting out several news stories every day, opinion pieces every day, linking to the most important anti-war stories around the internet. That's what we're doing at antiwar.com. So if you want to help us keep going, consider on heading on over to the site and making a donation. We ask for $80,000 a few times a year. We really don't have that big of a budget. All of our money is coming from individuals. We don't get corporate donations. So if you would like to help us out, head on over to antiwar.com and make a donation. Also want just kind of update people on the show. We've had about 2-year partnership with Paloma Verde. Carlos and his wife Vanessa Ablar have been absolutely fantastic. I actually went to their home for a Paloma Verde event last year, but I recently talked with them and they are moving on with different ventures that they have and shutting down shop at Paloma Verde. So we're not going to have that CBD company as a sponsor anymore. So, right now looking for a sponsor, but if you want to help out the show today, make a donation at the Libertarian Institute or antiwar.com, and just share the show. You can also find the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee, and follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. Let's get into the news. First story up today: Venezuelan embassy in U.S. closes as opposition crumbles. U.S. says opposition to Maduro not changing, and this is by Jason Ditz from antiwar.com. The Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. has followed up on the ouster of opposition figure Juan Guaido, announcing that they will close the facility. This effectively caps the U.S. policy of the past several years. In early 2019, the U.S. started backing Guaido as the leader of Venezuela, recognizing him as the head of state and moving to oust the actual president Nicolas Maduro. This included seizing revenue, setting up pro-Guaido forces in the embassy, and taking military intervention to impose regime change. So, some of the highlights of this policy that we could look back are, first, the fact that when Guaido claimed himself to be president, he went on stage and said, by the Venezuelan constitution, the 2018 elections are illegitimate. This was all orchestrated by Washington. It was called the Lima Group because at the time the Peruvian government was favorable to this regime change policy as well. But, you have and then the Colombian government, the Brazilian government at the time too. I think it was Duque in Colombia and Bolsonaro, of course, in Brazil. And then, U.S. other partners in the region, Canada, I think the Europeans, particularly the UK, were all lined up on this operation. So in 2019, Guaido says, I'm president, even though he was just an elected representative and had ended up as the head of, I think it was the National Assembly. It was some legislator in Venezuela that was set up to be controlled by the opposition. And so, he's headed that even though he doesn't have any national recognition. It's like picking some random U.S. representative to just become it would be like tomorrow or something, Mike McCarthy declaring himself president because, actually the 2020 election was illegitimate or something like that. This is the level that we're working on here. But this was the U.S. policy in Venezuela. This was started under Donald Trump when he had, of course, John Bolton in his administration. And this is a real press that they do. They, Richard Branson, I believe, was the billionaire that set up a big, what was supposed to be a benefit concert on the border. They were supposed to ship all this humanitarian aid into Venezuela. And what happened was actually the Venezuelan opposition set that on fire. And, this was a big story that was completely misreported by the American mainstream media. There's a couple other real true true coup attempts that Guaido orchestrates. That, one time he's like staying outside a military base trying to rally the troops to his side. But no matter what he did, he essentially made no progress anywhere. This also creates a issue at the U.S. or the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. You had people so the U.S. gave Venezuelan assets, the Venezuelan embassy, to the opposition and took it away from the actual government of Venezuela. And so, this opposition led by Guaido had a lot of money, and it seems a lot was moved corruptly and all that. Very problematic here. And so a lot of money was stolen. Another event you have is the Venezuelan embassy in D.C. The Venezuelan government, led by Maduro, says to, left-wing activists in the United States, led by Code Pink and et cetera, they actually were, allowed in there because Maduro's representatives couldn't be in the U.S. And eventually, I think it might have been the Capitol Police, but somebody involved with the U.S. government expelled and charged all those people who were occupying that embassy. This was again Kopik. I think Matt Blumenthal was there for a time. Kevin Zeese was one of the main protesters, and of course, this was one of the real last things that he did before he passed away. And you do have to wonder, maybe if the stress from the absolutely ridiculous charges here, contributed at all to his heart attack or anything. But so this has now fallen apart. It was an absolute sham to begin with. It never gained momentum in 4 years. It really hurt the Venezuelan people because the U.S. turned the sanctions dial up on Caracas by, to the level of 10, trying to replicate the Syrian, the Iranian, the North Korean sanctions that try to cripple and destroy those countries' governments. That's what the U.S. was doing here. We're now essentially admitting that didn't work, but they don't have any real way to adopt a new policy for Venezuela because they can't just recognize them. Well, they could, but DC logic being what it is, you can't just recognize the Maduro government and admit that you were wrong. So let's move on and talk about some Russian news now. First up, Putin's Christmas ceasefire doesn't hold. The ceasefire ordered by Russian President Vladimir Putin for the Orthodox Christmas did not hold, as heavy shelling was reported in eastern Ukraine on Friday and Saturday. This is, what I essentially expected to happen here. I guess a couple of things to add in. This seemed, at least publicly, what we know, this appeared very impromptu. My guess is that, the Kremlin did work with the Russian Orthodox Church to get the leader of that church to recommend this ceasefire. Now, my guess is that Ukraine would have maybe been more receptive to it if this was something that was discussed and planned for several weeks, rather than just seeming as an impromptu thing thrown together by Russia at the end. And so there may have been a legitimate concern in the West that Russia was trying some kind of tactical thing here, that they just wanted to pause fighting for 36 hours to get their troops ready for some kind of reinforcement or something like that. At the same time, to completely dismiss a ceasefire, and ceasefires can be thrown together very quickly. And so the fact that it doesn't seem like there was any interest in Kiev in the West at all is equally problematic here. It's not exactly clear to me what happened on the ground in Ukraine. The Russian side basically said that that the Ukrainians kept fighting, and so they kept fighting, but in a more defensive manner. So this ceasefire doesn't go anywhere. That's very unfortunate, but I really didn't. This is why I expected to happen, essentially. Now let's move on and talk about the latest U.S. arms package. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. to send Ukraine Bradley fighting vehicles in nearly $3 billion arms package. The U.S. is going to send Ukraine Bradley fighting vehicles for the first time in a new weapons package that is worth nearly $3 billion, U.S. officials told the Associated Press on Thursday. They're going to send 50 Bradleys, which are armored infantry troop protection that are equipped equipped with a 25 millimeter gun. Now, we have the response from Zelensky, and Dave wrote this up on Sunday, January 8th, that he said on Twitter, thanked President Biden for the all-time defense package and said it was an awesome Christmas present for Ukraine that would bring a common victory for the U.S. and Ukraine, although, there's already Ukrainian officials asking for more. We now have a full list of what's in that $3 billion package, so I did just want to quickly read through this for everyone. So it's the 50 Bradleys, 500 TOW anti-tank missiles, and 250,000 rounds of ammunition for the 25 millimeter gun, 100 M113 armored personnel carriers, 55 MRAPs, 138 high mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, 18 155 millimeter self-prepared howitzers, and 18 ammunition support vehicles, 70,155 millimeter artillery round, 500 precision guided 105 millimeter artillery rounds. I'm trying to figure out if those are the Excalibur rounds or not. Those are made by Raytheon particularly, and they do extend the range quite a bit of the 125 millimeter cannon. Nets is 1,200 155 millimeter rounds of remote anti-armor mine systems, 36 105 millimeter towed howitzers, and almost 100,000 rounds of ammunition for those guns, 10,000 120 millimeter mortar rounds, additional ammunition for the HIMARS, RIM-7 missiles for air defense. I think those might go in the Patriots, but I have to check. 4,000 Zuni anti-aircraft rockets, approximately 2,000 anti-armor rockets, sniper rifles, machine guns, and ammunition for grenade launchers and small arms, Claymore anti-personnel munitions, night vision devices and optics, spare parts, and other field equipment. So this is a very significant aid package, and I think Dave pointed this out in his antiwar.com show, which everybody should check out every day. It's fantastic. But Dave says that most of this aid did come through the presidential drawdown, but some of it came through, I believe, the Ukrainian Defense Initiative Fund, or whatever that thing's called, UAID. I believe it's the acronym, and that's when the U.S. government is purchasing weapons for Kiev rather than just transferring Kiev American-made weapons. Next up here, Sweden says it can't meet some of Turkey's demands to join NATO. This is a really big story here, that this NATO membership for the two Nordic countries might not happen, and we're going to see what happens when one party stands up in NATO. When these kind of things are happening in the U.S. now, like say the House Speaker race, where you have a small group of Republicans who prevent the larger body from doing what they want, the masses absolutely, the leader of the masses freak out, but then, rally the masses along with them. And, we have like Dan Cranshaw referring to these Republicans, his colleagues, from the same party, as terrorists. And so I do wonder how NATO is going to react to Turkey here, and if they are going to in some way look to punish Turkey for trying to hold out here. Now, I believe Hungary hasn't approved the NATO membership for these two states either, although they did say they're planning to do it sometime early this year. So Dave writes, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Kristersson said Sunday that Turkey has made demands for Sweden that it cannot fulfill as a part of Ankara's conditions for the Nordic nation to join NATO. Turkey confirms that we have done what we said we will do, but they also want things we can't do and won't give them. So the decision is now with Turkey, he said, he was sworn in as prime minister in October. Sweden and Finland signed a deal with Turkey to join NATO last June, but Turkey's parliament still hasn't approved their membership. Ankara says the main problem with the two countries is their alleged support for the PKK, a Kurdish militant group in Turkey. The U.S. and EU consider a terrorist organization, although the PKK is very closely aligned with the YPG, the SDF, whatever you want to call the Syrian Kurds, which we arm and fund and support and allow them to control a quarter of Syria. So there is a lot of support in NATO for the Kurds in this region, and it's not surprising to me that we're getting to this impasse. I guess let's see how Turkey responds and what happens here. So another story on Turkey where, Turkey is really cynically leveraging their position in NATO to abuse their minority population, the Kurds, and to take as much of Syria as possible. That's really what Erdogan is doing, the Turkish leader is doing with that NATO bid. It is no way a real interest, I think, in curtailing the war in Ukraine or trying to bring about peace or anything like that. Although, maybe Erdogan is in a position where he can't really say it, but he doesn't want to let these two countries join NATO because it's going to escalate and inflame tensions with Moscow and hurt the relationship between Ankara and Moscow, and so he's coming up with all kinds of ridiculous excuses to keep those two countries. I mean, that's kind of possible, but my guess is that it's more a cynical ploy for his own personal, political, domestic, ethnic, cultural issues that Turkey has with the Kurds. It's really unfair to the Kurds. I'm not, trying to downplay what they're going through at all. Just, what Erdogan's doing here. So Dave writes, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan spoke with Vladimir Putin on Thursday and said Ankara is ready to mediate between Moscow and Kiev to reach a lasting peace. And I wanted to add here that we have a story from Israel. The Israeli FM foreign minister passed the U.S. message to Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov. And so there is some, a little bit going on here. It's not exactly any indication that we're going to see any improvement, but I do think that Turkey actually reached out and again, kind of pressed and is trying to get Russia involved here and maybe trying to facilitate something going on. So, you know what? I don't want to completely write off that there's some hope that there's some negotiations going on here. And Turkey's role in all this is very interesting. So, next up, Ukraine sanctions dozens of Russian artists for allegedly supporting the war. Ukraine on Saturday placed over 100 Russian artists and public figures on a sanctions list for their alleged support for the Russian invasion. That list includes TV personalities, singers, musicians, who an advisor to the Ukrainian president called propagandists of death. Anna Nekurbo, a Vienna-based opera singer, is one of the most famous figures on the list. She came under criticism for allegedly supporting the war, despite speaking out against the conflict. I am opposed to this war. I am Russian, and I love my country, but I have many friends in Ukraine, and the pain and suffering right now breaks my heart. I want this war to end, and for the people to be able to live in peace. This is what I hope and pray for, she wrote on Facebook shortly after the Russian invasion. So, this is quite shocking how, again, anybody who is even in the camp of, I want this war to end, and Ukraine and the West had some fault in, bringing this invasion on, it is being denounced at this point. And this is just another example of it. So this is a really important story from Brett Wilkins. Pentagon doc reveals U.S. lied about Afghan civilians killed in 2021 drone strike. just very quickly, I'm sure everybody who listens to this show generally remembers as the U.S. was exiting Afghanistan 2021, they carried out a drone strike on a car in downtown Kabul. Initially, they claimed they successfully killed a terrorist and prevented an attack. In reality, they killed a Afghan man who worked for a U.S. based charity and 7 children. So Brett Wilkins writes, U.S. military officials knew that an August 2021 airstrike. Drone strike in Kabul likely killed Afghan civilians, including children, but lied about it, a report published on Friday revealed. New York Times investigation analyzed a 66-page redacted UN Central Command report on the August 29th, 2021 drone strike that killed 10 members of the Ahmadi family, including 7 children outside their home in the Afghan capital. The strike took place during the chaotic final days of the U.S. ground war in Afghanistan, just 3 days after a bombing that killed at least 182 people, including 13 American troops, at Kabul's international airport. Ahmadi, a 43-year-old aid worker for the California-based nonprofit Nutrition and Education International, was carrying water containers that were mistaken for explosives when his Toyota Corolla was bombed by a Lockheed Martin Hellfire missile fired from a General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper drone. Reports of civilian casualties began circulating hours after the airstrike. U.S. military officials claimed there were no indications that combatants were harmed in the attack, while stating that they would investigate whether a secondary explosion may have killed or wounded people nearby. However, as the Times details, portions of a U.S. Central Command investigation obtained by the New York Times shows that military analysts reported within minutes of the strike that civilians may have been killed, and with 3 hours had assessed that at least 3 children were killed. The document also provides detailed examples of how assumptions and biases led to the deadly blunder. Military analysts wrongly concluded, for example, a package loaded into a car contained explosives because it was careful handling and size, and that the driver's erratic route was evidence that he was trying to evade surveillance. Furthermore, the investigation refers to an additional surveillance drone not under military control that was also tracking the vehicle but does not specify what it observed. The Times confirmed that the drone was operated by the CIA and observed children possibly in the car moments before the impact, as CNN had reported. U.S. military officials initially claimed the righteous strike had prevented an imminent new attack on the airport. However, they later admitted that the botched bombing was a horrible mistake. So they knew, and they praised, they celebrated this. It's just beyond disgusting. It's great that they got exposed on this one, but it probably happens all the time and they get away with it. U.S. sending delegation to Taiwan for trade talks and move sure to anger China. So, the U.S. isn't supposed to recognize Taiwan as an independent country by laws and agreements the U.S. has with Beijing, but the Biden administration just has continued to stomp all over the one China policy, and the U.S. is sending a delegation to Taiwan next week for talks with Taipei, the U.S. official trade representative said on Wednesday, in a move sure to anger Beijing. The U.S. and Taiwan agreed to hold the formal trade talks last year, and the first round was held in New York in November. Since Washington and Taiwan don't have official relations, the negotiations are being held under the auspice of their respective de facto embassies, the American Institute in Taiwan and the Taipei Economic Cultural Representative Office in the U.S. But the U.S. delegation is being led by Terry McCarthy, a U.S. trade official representative for China affairs, meaning the effort would being carried out by President Biden's executive office. The USTR said the meeting in Taiwan would be attended by officials from several other government agencies. According to the South China Morning Post, Yang Zhenni, Taiwan's deputy trade representative, will lead the Taiwanese delegation, which will include dozens of officials from other departments. China is against contact between high-level U.S. and Taiwanese government officials and views such cooperation as the U.S. moving away from the one China policy. Next up, Japan's Kishida vows stronger alliance with U.S. amid military buildup. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida on Wednesday vowed to expand Tokyo's alliance with the U.S. under his new controversial military spending plan that breaks away from the country's post-Cold World War II pacifism. Kishida made the comments when previewing an upcoming visit to Washington, D.C., where he will meet with President Biden on January 13th. So that's actually coming up this week. We will show the rest of the world an even stronger Japanese-U.S. alliance, which is a linchpin of Japanese security and diplomacy, Kishida said, according to the AP. We will also show further cooperation towards achieving a free and open Indo-Pacific. And this, of course, is going to exacerbate tensions not only with Beijing, but also with Pyongyang. China and the Philippines vow to handle maritime disputes through consultations. Good news to talk about on the show today. Philippines President Marcos Jr. met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing on Wednesday as the two leaders agreed to handle maritime disputes in a friendly manner through consultations. Tensions have been high between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea, as vessels from the two nations occasionally have standoffs near the disputed reefs. China, the Philippines, and several other Southeast Asian nations all have overlapping claims to the water. So if anybody wants to look here, everybody's claims in this region are quite bold. China's do appear to be about the boldest, although, Taiwan also has some very bold claims here. And, the Philippines claims extend pretty far, even I think over the median line between the Philippines and mainland China. So, there's a lot to be resolved here. But the fact that, the Philippines is now reaching out to China and working there to resolve this dispute rather than reaching out to Washington and getting more military support from the U.S. to resolve this dispute is actually really important. One last story on the Indo-Pacific here. U.S. South Korea in talks over holding joint nuclear exercises. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol has said that Seoul is in talks with the U.S. on holding joint exercises with U.S. nuclear forces, a move that would significantly raise tensions on the Korean Peninsula, and I'm sure would upset Beijing as well. Yoon's comments came a day after North Korean leader Kim Jong-un called for the exponential increase in Pyongyang's nuclear arsenal. Yoon said that being under a U.S. nuclear umbrella is no longer enough and wants South Korea's military to be involved in planning with U.S. nuclear forces. In the past, the concept of a nuclear umbrella was preparation against the Soviet Union and China before North Korea developed nuclear weapons. What we call extended deterrence was also the U.S. telling us not to worry because it will take care of everything. But now it's difficult to convince our people with just that, Yoon said in an interview published Monday. I think last Monday. The South Korean leader said that he reviewed positive feedback from the U.S. about the idea. Now the extended deterrence, we are in talks with the U.S. about the concept of joint planning and our joint exercises in terms of nuclear capabilities. The U.S. is quite positive about it. He said, again, I think this is going to really exacerbate tensions in the region. And, as I kind of briefly mentioned there, North Korea's Kim orders exponential expansion of nuclear arsenals. So look for North Korea to ramp up the number of nukes they have. U.S. says it opposes country normalizing with Assad after Syria-Turkey talks. And so this is a 13-year war now. The U.S. hasn't had any, the U.S. public, anybody you talk to on the street, if you tell them to list their top 100 concerns, Syria is not going to be on that list. It just is. And it hasn't been for 5, maybe 7, 8 years now. Certainly since the beginning of the Trump administration, there's been pretty minimal care. Trump tried to pull out of Syria at one point. Oh, now we care about the Kurds for a couple minutes, even though, when it comes to Sweden and Finland joining NATO, then, we support actually them selling out the Kurds to get NATO membership from Turkey. So, go figure how all this works. But other countries in the Middle East. Syria is a key player in the region. Assad won a very crucial civil war and retained power. That was an American regime change operation against them. That they used their Al-Qaeda shock troops. They used, hundreds of thousands of ISIS to try to remove Assad from power. And, it took careful brokering on his part with the Iranians, with the Russians, with the Shiites in Lebanon to work together to put together a coalition that could go out and defeat the U.S. jihadists, and as well as there were dissidents within their own population. It's not like every single person who took up arms against Assad was waving the black flag of Al Qaeda, and certainly the Kurds in the eastern half of the country essentially were able to break off and declare independence. And they do carry out human rights abuses in Syria and Kurdistan. There's reports from parents saying that, look, they're conscripting our 15-year-old daughters. There's reports of female genital mutilation and other things like that in this region. The Al-Hol prison camp that the Kurds run is a absolute hellhole. So, it's not like these are the greatest people in the world, but that they're not dipping people in acid, cutting off heads, and just being general jihadist menaces as the Al-Qaeda and the ISIS fighters in the country were. So, but anyways, more and more people are looking to normalize relations with Assad as it's becoming more and more clear that war has been clearly won by Damascus. But the U.S. does not want that to happen. What they want to happen is for the Syrian people to suffer indefinitely. We also have rampant Israeli attacks in Syria still. Israeli missile strikes put Damascus International Airport out of service. So this was last week. It took a couple days, but they got the airport back running. But this happens all the time in Syria, that the Israelis are just constantly attacking their facilities. Now, maybe one of the more important things that happened in Syria last week, CENTCOM on Wednesday said 2 rockets were fired at a base in eastern Syria housing U.S. troops earlier in the day, and reported there were no casualties from the incident. After the attack took place, mission support site Conoco, a U.S. base at the Conoco gas field in eastern Syria's Deir ez-Zor province. As a part of the occupation of Syria, the U.S. and Kurdish allies control most of the country's oil and gas resources. CENTCOM said the U.S.-backed Kurdish-led SDF found the site from where the rockets were fired and found that a third was unfired. The command did not attribute blame for the attack. So it doesn't seem at this point, it's been a few days now, that the U.S. is going to escalate against whoever carried out this attack. But it should be a sign that, we could always escalate the situation in Syria quite rapidly. This very important. Yemen's Houthis seek a permanent ceasefire with the U.S.-backed Saudi coalition. A Houthi spokesperson on Yemeni TV said on Sunday, this is, huge. If this war could end before the fighting really escalates, then, there's a real chance that the bleeding stops. But that isn't happening at this point. And remember, the White House just doubled down on their support for Saudi Arabia by stomping out the War Powers resolution that was moving through Congress that would have further curbed the U.S. support for that conflict. This last story I have today by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. airstrikes in Somalia increased by 30% in 2022. U.S. airstrikes in Somalia rose by 30% in 2022. The Biden administration has escalated its involvement in the war against Al-Shabaab. According to data compiled by the Long War Journal, project of the Hawkish Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's think tank, U.S. AFRICOM launched at least 15 airstrikes in Somalia in 2022, up from 11 the previous year, although I'm guessing that huge numbers here are not being reported. And just like the situation in Afghanistan, even if they know that they killed civilians, they don't care. They're not going to tell us. They're just going to claim they killed Al-Shabaab. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today, everyone. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'll be back with more shows later in the week.